Pyro was once the most powerful element in Genshin Impact by leaps and bounds. For most if not all of version 1 and for the better part of version 2, these two elements had a stranglehold on the metagame for two reasons. One, the majority of the first wave of new units that came out consisted almost entirely of either of them, with virtually no development for the other elements. And two, the abundance and prevalence of the amplifying reactions Vaporize and Melt, which at the time were much easier to understand conceptually than the comparatively weaker transformative reactions. Fast forward to the modern era and the tables have turned. While there's still a veritable reason to use Cryo and Pyro teams, their market share has diminished considerably from where they initially were. Currently, Hydro, Dendro, Anemo, and Electro all but dominate the meta thanks to their wide range of party compositions, consistent DPS, and fantastic coverage, whether single target or AOE. The broad strength of Pyro was usually overshadowed by that of its counterparts. Things have started to come around for Pyro in version 4 though, courtesy of Lyney at the start of the version, followed by some fairly serviceable 4-stars in Chevreuse and Gaming. With the long, and I emphasize long-awaited release of the Harbinger Arlecchino, is this Pyro's return to form. That's what we'll be discussing in this video. Of the 7 elements, Pyro is easily the most straightforward, being the element focused on power above all else. Expectedly, damn near every single Pyro unit in Genshin has a playstyle heavily founded on damage, lots and lots of damage. The element's foundational mechanics are based on power, a message that has been loyally adhered to by the game's earlier units, with Xiangling, Diluc, and Hu Tao serving as the frontrunners of the roster for quite some time, while Yanfei, Kui, and Yoimiya had modest results back in the day. Unfortunately, Pyro's black and white approach to combat has been proven to hold it back while other elements are further expanded on. Since most of its relevant cast members were based on straightforward power, either the exertion or enhancement of it, anyone who didn't explicitly subscribe to that doctrine was made to suffer because of it. Amber's focus on rapid Pyro application went against the notion of quality instead of quantity. Xinyan being split between Pyro and physical, attacking, and defending cemented herself as one of the worst units in the game. Thoma fared somewhat better than Xinyan, but all in all, even with the advent of Virgin and a possible niche role for Wander, his more supportive, shielding, and application-based gameplay made it really hard for him to adhere to what Pyro was best known for. For the better part of version 2 and even version 3 with all that transpired concerning Dia, there was a clear divide between the good Pyro units and the bad ones. Hoyo was tinkering around with the thought of making some more niche or gimmicky Pyro units that weren't just carbon copies of Bennett, Xiangling, and Hu Tao, and for the most part have struggled to pull Pyro away from that notion that power is everything. For better or worse, units would have to adhere towards the central theme of the element if they wanted to be successful. Consequently, Pyro took a backseat throughout version 3 as Electro, Hydro, and Dendro took over the meta, but then came version 4 and the new direction the meta followed. Fontaine made it very clear with its initial banners that they were aiming to break the mold, trying out new things to equalize the 7 elements as much as they could. With that came Lyney, the first actual good Pyro character to come out in over 2 years at that point. Unlike Yoimiya, who is a normal attacker, Lyney was an aim shot user, and to prevent him from directly competing against the likes of Hu Tao, they had the idea to make him forego reliance on Vaporize altogether, choosing instead to encourage a mono-Pyro team. Mono-elemental teams are inherently counterintuitive to the principal gameplay focus of Genshin being elemental reactions. Up until that point, prevailing wisdom believed that while mono teams were doable to an extent, they would more likely than not be inferior to reaction teams due to the sheer amount of extra damage reactions provided. So they supplemented, granting Lyney bonus damage against enemies affected by Pyro to the tune of not 20, not 30, or even 40%, 60%, which can increase to 100% if there are 2 more Pyro units in his party besides him. What I really enjoyed about Lyney is that he tapped into a strategy that has been considered less valuable given the absence of any reactions and turned it into a profitable opportunity. Lyney's mono Pyro team is more than strong, it is one of the most competitive teams in the game, but that was only because Hoyo knew that power is the source of strength for Pyro. If hypothetically Lyney only got 40% or even 60% from his A4 passive, a more normal amount to expect for that kind of passive, he would be far less effective. In that sense, they deliberately overtuned his numbers to account for what he was missing out on from reactions, instead of giving him the same numbers as everyone else. Okay, by this point you guys are wondering when I'm going to talk about Arlecchino, since that's probably why you clicked on the video in the first place. The reason I mentioned all that before talking about her is that Father's inclusion in the game solidifies 2 things, one positive and one negative. The Pyro element has the highest number of on-field main damage dealers in the game: Hu Tao, Lyney, Diluc, Kui, Yoimiya, Gaming, and Yanfei. The other elements have been able to expand and explore different niches by having most of their units consist of either sub-DPSers or supports. For example, in the Electro element, the only true dedicated on-fielders in the game are Sino, Kutsing, and Razor. Raiden Shogun can either be on main or sub depending on what you use her for, but that's only because Electro can tap into elemental reactions more agnostically than Pyro can. With that in mind, I was initially nervous about Arlecchino. The Pyro roster has very powerful damage dealers already, but more concerning is that the number of different available playstyles is decreasing. You have Hu Tao, who's a standard attacker, Gaming and by extension Diluc who are plunging attackers, Lyney who's an aim shooter, Yoimiya who's a ranged normal attacker, Additionally, Arlecchino uses polearms, naturally putting her in contention against Hu Tao, who has been the central Pyro polearm user ever since 1.3. That is, except for the psychopaths who use main DPS Xiangling. It is very easy for Pyro units to compete against each other due to how linear the element is both in concept and practice. And while you can always just play the waifu over a meta card, the fact still remains that pragmatically speaking, there are only two avenues of entry for Arlecchino: either directly power creep an existing character or have a different playstyle. While there's nothing wrong with a small bit of power creep every now and then, I don't think they want to keep doing this so often, especially with Neuvillette and Farina happening not too long ago. At the same time, empirically, whenever Hoyo tries a new playstyle for Pyro, it usually hasn't gone too well, exemplified by Xinyan and Dia. Gaming I guess is fine, but for most people he's still pretty gimmicky. I realized, however, there's one aspect that still has yet to be tapped into: AOE coverage. Pyro units, for the most part, are not really well known for their attack range. Their on-field pressure is massive, but usually restricted to boss killing or fighting tightly clumped up enemies. Xiangling's the only exception to this. Why the hell is Xiangling the exception to everything? But she's still a sub-DPS. We don't really have an established AOE on-fielder, at least not before Arlecchino. While she and Hu Tao occupy the same element and weapon class and even gameplay factors depending on how you look at it, one distinction between them is that Arlecchino's a sweeper, someone who thrives on clearing groups of enemies. The more targets affected by her skill, the more she can charge up her Bond of Life, in turn granting bonus damage on her auto attacks after they get infused. While it's possible to max out her strength against one enemy, it's implied she wants to take on multiple, giving her a concrete advantage over other Pyro units who are for the most part 1v1ers. Now, as you know, AOE isn't exactly in short supply these days, so by no means is Arlecchino breaking new grounds, but it does allow her to stand out from her peers. Moreover, she's primarily a normal attacker. You use her charge attack to accumulate Bond of Life, but from then on, it's mostly normals, as her empowered state does not apply to charge attacks. What I like about her playstyle is that unlike most other Pyro units up until this point with sharp power spikes in that they go from dealing a ton of damage to dealing no damage, Arlecchino's engineered to allow the player a consistent stream of DPS depending on how well you play into her mechanic. Something that always frustrated me with Hu Tao is how long her downtime is. Guide to Afterlife only lasted 9 seconds while having a 16-second cooldown. Typically, you can take those 7 seconds to rotate through your supports and whatnot, but compared to more modern units who can achieve rotation times of 12 seconds or higher, I always wished it lasted just a bit longer. Yoimiya has a buff duration of 10 seconds but a cooldown of 18. If I'm not mistaken, you can technically have consistent uptime on Lyney, but being an aim shot attacker, his playstyle is an acquired taste. Arlecchino doesn't have sharp increases or decreases in power, rather she steadily fluctuates. Her core gameplay is to maintain as much Bond of Life on her as possible, as while attacking in her empowered state she continuously loses Bond of Life to increase her DPS, necessitating that you replenish it as often as possible. It's similar to Neuvillette where his Hydro Pump drains HP until half, but when accounting for his A4 passive you want to try to keep him above 80% at all times. Same mechanic here with Arlecchino, and why she's most comfortable when fighting multiple opponents. While attacking enemies, you always want to have as close to max Bond of Life as possible since each empowered normal attack draws from her current stockpile. It should be noted that her skill has an extremely long base cooldown of 30 seconds, which would otherwise be a red flag, but empowered normal attacks that consume Bond of Life reduce the cooldown of her skill. So in ideal circumstances, for her to get the best of every world, she has to continuously siphon Bond of Life from enemies while attacking to reduce her skill so she can use it again. Adding more depth to her gameplay is the fact that she cannot heal whatsoever except through a burst. In exchange though, she gains flat 40% bonus pyro damage for free just by existing. There's a lot of micromanaging in her kit, applying her skill to as many enemies as possible, maintaining as high of a Bond of Life stack as you can, and you also have to learn when to trade DPS for sustain, which by the way her ultimate consumes Bond of Life to deal damage and essentially full heal her. Conveniently however, when casting her burst, the cooldown of her skill gets reset, so you don't lose too much DPS from stopping to heal. I think that's another aspect that Pyro has not really covered yet. Arlecchino is fully self-contained. Most Pyro units have very specific teams they have to make use of to be competitive. Lyney needs Mono Pyro, aka Mr. Circle Impact, Hu Tao needs Hydro, and Diluc I guess needs Xianyun. On the other hand, Arlecchino's pressure does not require external compensation. The only thing you need is a shielder, but considering healing's all but useless on her, you were gonna bring a shielder anyway. Beyond that, anything is fair game. Mind you, just like with everyone else, she does have an optimal team, but despite her comparatively higher skill floor and ceiling, she's surprisingly party agnostic barring the shield requirement, making her a great choice for endgame and beginner players alike since in addition to her more interactive playstyle, she's compatible with many of the game's best supports right now. All things considered, she's very well designed, a high risk high reward playstyle that doesn't have anything egregiously out of place. What's ironic is that she has a more complex kit than Dia, and yet they executed on Arlecchino's moveset more competently. But I digress. Overall, I appreciate what they did with her. In terms of power level, she hovers roughly around the same strength as Hu Tao and Lyney, but with a wider range, as in there may be moments where she's weaker, but moments where she's stronger. It's clear she's no Neuvillette, but she doesn't have to be. I find her gameplay extremely appealing. Now if we bring constellations into the equation, being a version 4 unit, cons are practically game altering, and while I haven't spent much time reading into that part of her just from a surface glance, there are a ton of quality of life conveniences from her C1 and C2. What can I say, they figured out how to make a Pyro on-field attacker who doesn't step over the existing cast. Therein lies the positive side of the two factors I briefly mentioned. Genshin Impact is taking a more playstyle focused approach to the game, hinted to us with version 4's units. Navia, Risley, Lyney, Chiori, Shenyun, and Neuvillette. All 6 of these units are either up to par or better, exactly how it should be. At this point, if miHoYo releases a disaster like Dia, then it's 100% intentional. Arlecchino continues the trend by making her appeal based on playstyle. She doesn't break Pyro's current limits, but she allows you to enjoy those limits in a different way. This is a healthy direction for Genshin to take. For many players, it can be discouraging to have to adhere to a certain playstyle if you want to stay competitive. You might enjoy Pyro's straightforward nature, but not be a fan of Lyney's aim shot gameplay, or you might not like how Hu Tao has only a temporary boost in power. A consistent rushdown attacker like Arlecchino might be more your speed, and you can enjoy her knowing you're not sacrificing meta relevance for it. With all that said, at the risk of playing devil's advocate, I do think this paints a future problem. Arlecchino managed to thread the needle by tapping into niches that Pyro had yet to explore. AOE damage and sustained melee damage. She basically took the last open chair available in this, I guess, proverbial game of musical chairs. But what will happen then? It's self-evident that for units to succeed, they either have to be the best at something or the only one at something. Chevreuse expands on the overload reaction, Lyney brings in aim shots, Arlecchino brings normal attacks, Gaming brings plunging attacks, but what else is left? At a certain point, HoYo will run out of niches to fill because of how one-dimensional Pyro is, and will have to eventually resort to straight-up power creep, which is risky for an element that has so many units knocking against each other. The Animo element, for example, can play around with different niches like crowd control, reaction support, healing, mobility, what have you. They still have plenty of room for banger units without explicitly accelerating the power scaling of the game. The Hydra roster is very top-heavy, but barring Neuvillette who just breaks everything, Hydra units can tap into the niche of health manipulation, specific elemental reactions. You have Child who has the international team, Nilou with their Bloom team, Xingqiu and Yelan for follow-up attack damage, Ayato for soup teams, Kokomi for healing, Mona for freeze, ? There are so many more Hydra units they can release without affecting the current roster. Comparatively, Pyro has fewer roles. At the end of the day, it's about power. Arlecchino might be one of the last quote-unquote meta Pyro units that doesn't power creep the roster, and with Natlan coming very soon, people are speculating that this very well might be Bennett's last year of dominance, depending on what kit the Pyro Archon will have. Essentially, with Lyney, Chevreuse, Gaming to a minor extent, and of course Arlecchino, Pyro is back, which is great as Pyro has been neglected for a while, but from my perspective, I wonder what it will take for Pyro to keep staying relevant. Most of the elements have a niche besides power that they can fall back on. Pyro really doesn't. Sooner or later, they will have to release a unit that power creeps an existing one, whether Bennett, Xiangling, Hu Tao, or even Arlecchino. All it takes is a Pyro on field with insanely high DPS to substantially drop the market share of Hu Tao, Lyney, Arlecchino, Yoimiya, Diluc and such. Playstyle does matter, yes, but ultimately, if we go by practicality, there's a lot more overlap between Pyro's units in light of how many on-fielders there are. So unless they add a new transformative reaction for Pyro to open up a new niche, that's my thoughts on the element's condition for the time being. Arlecchino's a fantastic unit by design. I love how she, and by extension Child and Wander, have such unique playstyles. Makes me optimistic for the rest of the Harbingers. But I have concerns over what's going to happen to Pyro in the coming years. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think Pyro is reaching an inflection point, or do you think there's still plenty of viable niches for the element? Let me know in the comments down below. For now, if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow my Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my updated discussion on Geo if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.